Hero Time, Chapter 17, Past Mistakes. It took Jen 10 minutes to finish up with the control box and head up to meet Julie, who was admiring Kevin as he worked on the lock for the trunk of his car. Gwen was eyeing Julie. Jen snorted. Hey, Julie, come on, let's head out. Julie nodded and grinned at Jen as the two girls headed out. Gwen relaxed from her spot in the back seat of Kevin's car, her legs sticking out, and went back to the book in her lap. There was silence in the shop for a moment before Kevin spoke. So, who was feedback? Gwen froze. She must have been silent for a moment too long because Kevin spoke again. I didn't mean to intrude on the moment, but Julie was very insistent she find Jen. Gwen nodded. So you were there the whole time. She gently turned the page and frowned. Then she sighed. I don't remember her ever using feedback against you, so it makes sense you wouldn't remember the name. Kevin closed the trunk. Wait, so feedback was one of her aliens? Gwen nodded. Yeah, back when we were kids. Gwen sighed and closed the book. Azimuth had an old enemy, a corrupted galvanic mechamorph, went by the name Malware. She shrugged as Kevin stepped over to the back seat and leaned against the car frame next to her. Azimuth's enemies become Jen's rather quickly. Nothing new there. But the last time we fought Malware, it ripped feedback and Jen apart. Kevin's eyes went wide. Holy shit. I didn't think that could happen. Gwen nodded. Neither did we. I don't think even Azimuth saw that coming. He was there that day, which was why Malware was there in the first place. He was trying to kill Azimuth and wanted to take the Omnitrix to do it. He ripped feedback and Jen apart, and feedback just dissolved. But it was like for a second she reached out to Jen like she could help. I still have nightmares about screaming. A large hand reached out and gently laid itself on her shoulder. That was terrible. What happened to Malware? Jen did. Gwen let out a soft, humorless laugh. Something happened to the Omnitrix when feedback died, like a reset? I don't understand it. Azimuth didn't say anything about it to me. Maybe he explained it to Jen, I don't know. But it stopped Jen from transforming, so she punched Malware. She punched a galvanic mechamorph that wanted the Omnitrix. I'm assuming she punched it with the Omnitrix. Gwen nodded at Kevin. She did. It overloaded Malware. It exploded. We haven't seen it since, but she lost feedback for good that day. She was one of her favorite aliens, too. She used her all the time. It wasn't too long after that she took off the Omnitrix. She was never the same after, though. Gwen looked up at Kevin, who nodded. She does seem a bit more serious than the kid I met, and about 20 times more paranoid. Gwen nodded. I think losing feedback is part of the reason she took off the watch in the first place. But she never talked about it. She shuts down every time anyone mentions it, shuts them out, even me or Grandpa. Kevin shrugged. Knowing her, she blames herself for what happened. Gwen nodded. Been eating at her for 5 years. I don't want to add what happened to Grandpa to that. I think it might break her. I think we just need to be there for her, and let her take the lead on this whole hybrid DNAliens thing. Gwen nodded at Kevin. You're right. Kevin grinned. Can I get that in writing? Gwen laughed. I'm going to grab a soda from the machine outside. You want anything? Gwen shook her head and Kevin nodded, taking the side exit. Gwen flipped open her book again. Gwen? The voice was nervous, and looking up she spotted why. It was J.T. standing in the main garage door of the mechanic's shop. J.T., what do you want? Gwen wasn't normally hostile. She was the reasonable foil to her cousin's hero complex. She had to be reasonable and willing to listen. But she didn't really like Cash or JT. They picked on Jen, and Gwen was fiercely protective of her family. Always had been, always would be. A short argument later, and she sent JT packing, unknowingly, directly into Kevin's hands. Kevin dropped Gwen off before he went to get his revenge for hurting his car. He was not expecting what he found, though. The gauntlet was using Cash to reform the Technodrome. He contemplated how much of a problem that was going to be as he lay bruised and beaten on the floor of the old mannequin factory. Julie laughed as Jen threw the wrench across the yard. Chip slinked off after it. So your parents believed that he's a dog. Well, it took some convincing, but my parents are very relaxed. Julie shrugged. I wish my parents were that chill. Julie raised an eyebrow at Jen. They don't know? Jen shook her head at her friend's question. No. My parents are pretty relaxed. They let me do my own thing, but Jen paused as Ship slunk back up to her and spat out the wrench before making that same panting noise that meant he was excited. Jen nodded and pulled her phone out of her pocket. She seemed to think for a moment before she tossed the phone to Ship. He swallowed it, and the new creation fell to the ground. It shuddered, and Ship spat it back out at Jen, who caught it. Good boy. Can you mimic it? Ship seemed to think about it for a moment, then folded and shrunk into a phone identical to Jen's. Good boy. She picked up the phone and patted it. It turned back into Ship in her arms and nuzzled her. She laughed. Julie grinned. He's good at mimicking electronics he's already been. Do you think that means he can become the carnival rides he took over at the pier? Jen nodded. Possibly. But we should head out of town to try those. What was I saying? She shook her head and tossed the wrench for Ship again. Oh yeah, my parents let me do my own thing for the most of the time, but whenever they think I'm in danger, they get super overprotective. Dad especially. He didn't want me to go into soccer because when I was a kid I got a concussion playing softball. Julie let out a soft laugh. You got a concussion playing softball? Got hit with the ball. Kid at the bat had a mean swing. Julie laughed and Jen threw the wrench again for Ship, who was waiting patiently at her feet. Chapter 18. The Real Problem. Jen would admit she wanted to punch Cash for years. She could be petty, but not like this. Not when he was being physically and mentally taken over by an evil robot from space. But when Cash fired on Gwen, well, Jen could never abide a threat to family, and that's exactly what Cash and the Technodrone were. The brunette rolled behind a car in the parking lot and spun the dial on the Omnitrix, selecting chromostone. She wasn't sure Cash would be able to survive the kind of explosion Goop had caused inside the Technodrone. She leapt fully transformed out of her hiding spot and directly between Gwen and Cash, absorbing the blast like it was nothing. Though, to be honest, she wasn't so sure Cash was in charge anymore. Without the control box, the Technodrone didn't have any real driving force, no main objective. Cash seemed to be supplying that. Not that Jen wanted it to achieve its main objective, but she would worry about that later. For now, she had a bully to take down. Jen would admit she was impressed when Cash beat the Technodrone with just his will alone. She watched him toss the gauntlet aside, and if Chromostone had an eyebrow, she'd have raised it. She raised a hand and blasted the gauntlet. In seconds, it melted into molten slag. Apparently, without the control box or an organic host, the Technodrone lost some of its resilience. Cash nodded his thanks as he took JT's arm and the two walked away. The parking lot was deserted now, so Jen didn't bother hiding as a green light flashed around her and she transformed back to normal. A black unmarked car pulled up into the lot and Varaxi and Al stepped out. Al quick-stepped to Jen. Julie messaged me, are you well? Jen nodded, her eyes finding the molten slag still bubbling away on the asphalt. It smelled horrible. Chromostone didn't have a sense of smell. That was useful to know. She also hadn't known that Chromostone's redirected energy could melt metal. We're fine, Al. All taken care of. I can't help but feel we're forgetting something, Gwen said, frowning deeply. They were silent for a moment before the cousins looked at each other and spoke in unison. Kevin! They caught a ride with Varaxi and Al to find Kevin. It took them a while. He wasn't as easy for Gwen to find as Jen, so they had to stop by Kevin's house to get something of his. Jen pulled a bobby pin out of her cousin's hair and bent it until she had a workable lockpick. She twisted it in the lock and it clicked. She grinned and gestured Gwen inside. Al raised an eyebrow. Where did the wielder of the Omnitrix learn how to pick locks? Jen grinned at Varaxi's question and raised eyebrows. Grandpa Max was a great teacher. Gwen laughed at her cousin. Your grandfather was a decorated plumber. Why did he know how to pick locks? That's a long story. One we don't really have time to get into right now. Cash said something about beating Kevin. We should find him as soon as possible. Varaxi nodded, still looking a bit confused. Gwen grabbed a t-shirt and closed her eyes for a moment, focusing. Then she nodded. Got him! It was well into evening by the time they reached the warehouse. It was old, falling to pieces in places. Al insisted on following them, in case they needed medical assistance. Varaxi took one look at the place and followed them as well. She let Jen take point, though. The place was empty except for Kevin, who was laying on the hard floor, still mostly covered in stone. "You've looked better," Jen said, reaching out a hand to him. He groaned. "Cash wanted to meet you at 3 at the Mr. Smithy's parking lot." Jen snorted as she pulled Kevin to his feet. He shed the stone, for which she was glad, but he was heavily bruised and burned where there hadn't been stone. Al stepped forward as Jen deposited him in a chair. Varaxi frowned and nodded. "You have enough Mosian on your team. Very useful teammate." Kevin grinned as Al healed him. "Half, technically. My dad was Osmosian." Jen raised an eyebrow. Kevin grinned at Gwen. "You thought you were the only ones with plumber ancestors?" Jen rolled her eyes. "Speaking of, we have plumber business to discuss. Best done in private. I want the two of you to head to the safe house and stay there until I give you the clear, okay?" Varaxi nodded. Al frowned as he healed the last of Kevin's burns. "Is everything all right?" Jen shook her head. "An overabundance of caution." Varaxi nodded and took Al's arm, escorting him out of the factory with minimal arguing. Once they were gone, Jen turned to Kevin. "You're parked around here, right?" Kevin nodded. Now fully healed, he led the girls to his car and drove away from the warehouse. "Go to the hole. Ed gave me a key." He nodded. Gwen frowned. "Jen, what is this about?" Jen shook her head. "Not here." She didn't speak again until they reached the hole. She grabbed a sledgehammer from the tools and headed to the elevator. "Come on," she said, holding the door. Gwen shrugged and stepped into the elevator. Kevin rolled his eyes and followed the two girls. Once they were safely ensconced in the hole, Jen grabbed the control box and tossed it onto the floor. Then, without warning, she swung the hammer. Gwen jumped as the smack sounded through the room, small chips of metal flying through the air. Jen swung the hammer again. "What the hell?" Kevin covered his eyes. As Jen swung again, the box finally collapsed. She swung a third time, and the internal components of the box collapsed. She swung one more time, and everything splintered. "Okay, so that's done." Kevin blinked, lowering his hands. "What the actual fuck, Tennyson?" "I gotta agree with Kevin here. What was that?" Jen swung the hammer up over her shoulder and frowned. "Well, I thought that was obvious. The Technodrone was here for Al." They both blinked. Jen pointed to the computer. "Display the Technodrone's objective, please, computer." There was a beep, and the computer did as it was asked. Kevin blinked. "Oh, hell." "Yep. I'm missing something obvious here?" Jen nodded. "It was looking for the biggest, most powerful mana signature, assuming it would be an Apollinite. But we have a heavy hitter on our team." Gwen nodded. "Which is why it attacked Gwen in the first place." Jen nodded at Kevin. "Got it in one." Jen set down the sledgehammer. "They don't expect the Technodrome to get destroyed, do they? The people or whatever who make these?" She gestured at Kevin as she slid into her chair. "No, they don't." Jen grinned. "Good. Then they won't assume that an Apollinite destroyed it." Kevin shrugged. "No, they've got a camera. Sort of. They'll have seen everything the Technodrome did up until you smashed it with a hammer. Smart move." "I sort of figured that was the case. Most robots we have on Earth have some kind of control like that, a failsafe to see if it's been stolen. Would make sense for an actual alien robot to have it." Kevin nodded as Gwen sat down. "That was really clever." Jen rolled her eyes. "Don't sound so surprised. I do have good ideas." Gwen rolled her eyes. Chapter 19. The Call. Jen called Al and Varaxi and gave them the all-clear that night. She frowned at her phone as it started to ring again. She blinked at the number. It was just a bunch of 8s. She frowned and ignored the call. Her phone rang 3 more times that night. She eventually turned it off. The number was always different, but it was always just one number repeated 8 times. She frowned as she pulled up to Gwen's house the next day. Her phone was going off again. Her mom had told her to turn it back on. Kevin's car was already there. Jen ignored the call and headed inside. An hour later, Jen threw her phone across the room. "This thing is so stupid." Kevin frowned. "What's wrong with it?" He stooped and picked up the phone, with a small crack now running through the screen. "It won't stop ringing. I don't know the number. It's weird numbers, too." Kevin rolled his eyes. "Have you thought about answering it?" Jen rolled her eyes. "You don't answer numbers you don't know. Everyone knows that." Kevin rolled his eyes and looked down at the phone in his hands as it began to ring again. He stared. Answer it. He held out the phone. Come on, Kevin, She went silent as she stared at the phone. Gwen frowned, looking up from her book. What's wrong? Then Gwen looked at the phone in Kevin's hands and read the caller ID. Grandpa Mac. The three of them stared at the phone as it rang for a moment before Jen lunged at Kevin and snatched the phone out of his hands. Who is this? She demanded as she answered the phone, not bothering with pleasantries. Come to La Soledad. The voice was echoing, and so loud Jen had to pull the phone away from her ear. She tapped the speakerphone on and repeated her question. Who is this? How did you get the phone you're calling from? Come to La Soledad. Who is this? Come to La Soledad. Tell me who this is. Help me. There was a click over the line, and the three of them stared at it for another minute, completely silent. Jen grabbed her jacket and took off for the door. Gwen stopped her with a bright pink block over the door. This could not be a clearer trap. How did they get Grandpa's phone? I don't know, Gwen said, standing from her spot on the couch. But it's clearly a trap. Kevin frowned. Why didn't he answer her question? Both girls turned to him. They looked up and he raised his hands. I'm just thinking out loud. Why didn't he answer her questions? Best way to get Jen to do something is to give her a story. Best a sob story. They both raised eyebrows at him. He shrugged. I wouldn't be a criminal mastermind if I didn't know that. Come on. 2 words you heroes can't resist. Help me. Jen rolled her eyes and pulled up the browser on her phone. La Soledad is about half an hour's drive away from here. There's nothing there. It's an abandoned military base. Jen frowned at her phone. It's been vandalized recently, but no one's doing anything about it. It's just been left to rot. She frowned. We can't go out there. I'm going out there. I have to know what's going on. Kevin looked over Jen's shoulder at the article she pulled up. Strange lights in the place, rampant destruction for no reason. Sounds just up our alley. Gwen frowned. So we're walking right into a trap. 2 to 1, yes, we're going. Gwen rode in the back for the half-hour trip to La Soledad. It was extremely awkward and silent. Not even the radio played, mostly because Jen hated Kevin's station and he refused to change it. So they were all relieved to get out of the car when they arrived at the deserted army base. It didn't take them long to get attacked, except the being wasn't attacking them. It ignored them entirely. It was going after the buildings. Jen frowned as she transformed back to normal inches from the rubble of the front face of the building. She knelt and ran a hand through the track left behind by the creature. It was covered in dust. She frowned and brushed the dust off her hand onto her pants. At least the building it destroyed wasn't the library, Gwen said. Kevin rolled his eyes. You really love the books, huh? Jen rolled her eyes at Kevin. She means we need to do some research. Sadly, unlike crime, heroism isn't exactly something easy to do. Kevin frowned as both girls stepped over to the building they seemed to know was the library. How come you two know so much about military bases? Grandpa Mac. Kevin nodded. Grandpa Mac's had a hand in everything, huh? Gwen grinned and Jen nodded. Yep. Gwen grabbed a microfilm off the shelf and fed it into the computer. I think I found something. Jen had experienced all sorts of reactions to her aliens, from abject terror to childlike glee. Nostalgia had never been a reaction she'd experienced before. The grin on his face confused her. Swamp fire, that takes me back. Or is it forward? It's so hard to tell, Jen. Have we met? Jen frowned as she let go of the man's lab coat. How do you know my name? No one they hadn't already met should know Swampfire. She didn't recognize this man. It threw her off. Have we met? Yes, I suppose it should be. Would you like a gumball? Jen blinked. No thanks. Swampfire doesn't have teeth like people. Probably shouldn't risk gumballs. Wait, why do you know me? The man smiled as he slipped the bag of gumballs back into his pocket. Oh, we're old friends. Or rather, we will be. Kevin and Gwen had caught up with them by now, and Kevin pointed out the painfully obvious. It's the dork from the photo, the paradox guy. You haven't aged a day in 50 years. The man, Paradox, shook his head at Gwen, a fond look in his eyes. Oh, considerably longer than that, Gwen. Kevin frowned. You two know this guy? Jen shook her head. Gwen frowned, her hands glowing pink. Jen, do we know him? No. Gwen struck quickly, and they all blinked as Paradox vanished. Gwen? The redhead shook her head at her currently plant-like cousin. Ha-ta! The voice of the man came from outside this time. The three teens turned to the windows. The man was leaning against a rusted light pole outside. We need to talk to him. He's clearly linked to that creature. Gwen grabbed Jen's hands, vines under her skin warm with the fire that burned within. Last time we tangled with time travelers, it did not go well, Jen nodded. You two fought time travelers? Story for another time, Jen said as she dodged around her cousin and into the street. The man stepped behind the light pole and vanished again. Jen blinked and held back, but Kevin had no such reservations. He rushed into the fight like he always did, and it did not go well for him, especially when the creature showed up.